Okay, so the next part of the lecture is going to be about portal systems and the HPA axis. I put a little graphic at the bottom. It just kind of demonstrates very basically what the negative feedback loop regarding this specific hormonal pathway is, and we're going to talk about that a little bit moving forward. So a little bit about portal systems. They are small circulatory systems consisting of two capillary beds in very close proximity. And they facilitate the quick release and transport to target tissue of hormones. So normally in circulatory pathways, they only go through one capillary bed before returning to the heart. And that's because when blood goes through a capillary bed, there's a significant drop in hydrostatic pressure. So it really needs to make it to the heart again in order to reoxygenate and re-up on hydrostatic pressure, because otherwise it's not really going to be able to get any nutrients into the surrounding cells. Fortunately, with this portal system, the two capillary beds are very close to each other. And it just ends up working that after the blood goes through that first capillary bed, it ends up going through the second one. And it can release all of the hormones in that second capillary bed, and it doesn't actually get into systemic circulation. So the first capillary bed, like I just mentioned very briefly, allows the hypothalamus to release releasing or inhibiting factors that will travel an extremely short distance before reaching the next portal bed that connects the next capillary bed that connects to the anterior pituitary gland. So in that first bed, the first capillary bed is by the hypothalamus. The second capillary bed is by the pituitary gland. So in the first one, these tropic hormones, which we're referring to as releasing or inhibiting factors, they enter that first capillary bed. They travel a very short distance, and then they reach the next capillary bed where they actually diffuse into the pituitary gland. So this second capillary bed actually allows the hypothalamic hormones to be taken up by the pituitary gland without getting into the systemic circulation. So humans have two portal systems. We have this portal system. I think it's called the hypophyseal portal system. I think I have it on one of those slides. And the other one is the hepatic portal system with your liver. There are actually two portal beds that connect your digestive system and your liver, because your liver actually needs to filter some toxins out of what you eat before it reaches your heart and before it enters your systemic circulation. So the hypothalamus, the first stop in the HPA axis. The hypothalamus has multiple roles in daily functioning. We may have spoken about it before in previous lectures when we were talking about the brain. It controls circadian rhythm, controls body temperature, hunger, it manages stress levels, and it houses the brain's reward center, the dopamine-driven reward center. But we're not going to be talking too much about that in today's lecture. We're just going to be talking about its hormonal control on the body. So the hypothalamus exerts endocrine control over the body in two ways. So the first way, which we've previously discussed, is by sending releasing or inhibiting factors through the portal system to the anterior pituitary lobe to control its production of other hormones. So the pituitary lobe is split, the pituitary gland is split into two lobes, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And the hormones that are released by the hypothalamus include corticotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, and gonadotropin releasing hormone, and thyrotropin releasing hormone, among others. So you see this tropin releasing hormone. These are the releasing factors. These are the tropic hormones that we're talking about. Tropic hormones are any hormones that control the inhibition or release of another hormone. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary both release these tropic hormones. And the hypothalamus also creates its own hormones and delivers them to the posterior pituitary gland where they are released. So the hypothalamus releases tropic hormones that allow the anterior pituitary to release its own hormones, but it also creates hormones and it delivers them to the posterior pituitary. So I'm going to clarify this on the next slide. So if it's confusing, don't worry. We are going to talk about it right now. So the pituitary gland, if you look on the left, it's a tiny, tiny gland that sits right at the base of the middle brain. And it is a small gland. It maintains contact with the hypothalamus through the hypophyseal portal system, the anterior lobe, and the pituitary stalk, which is how the posterior lobe is connected to the hypothalamus. So the anterior lobe is also known as the adenohypophysis. of the pituitary gland is made up of true endocrine tissue. So when we say true endocrine tissue, we mean that it's actually producing the hormone that it's secreting. So the anterior lobe is true endocrine tissue because it produces and secretes the hormone. So upon receiving hormonal input from the hypothalamus via that portal system that we just discussed, the anterior lobe will produce and release up to 7 hormones. So this is follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, ACTH, I think it's adrenocorticotropic hormone, TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin, endorphins, and growth hormone are all released by the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So I've seen a lot of different study materials. They use the acronym FLAT-PEG, and I think it's pretty helpful because it's the one that I use and it's the one I used for the MCAT. So FLAT-PEG is the acronym that will help you remember the anterior lobe, what is created in the anterior lobe. So FLATPEG. You definitely want to know those. I do see them pop up every once in a while, and even if they pop up on like the psychosocial in some sort of passage, it's always a good idea to have background information of it. So that's the anterior lobe. And we also have the posterior lobe, which is known as the neurohypophysis. And the posterior lobe, in contrast to the anterior lobe, is not made of true endocrine tissue. So that means it's not creating, it's releasing hormones, but it's not creating the hormones. So we don't consider it a true endocrine tissue. It releases hormones that are produced by the pituitary, that are produced by the hypothalamus. So we talked before about the, right over here, hold on. I thought it was on that slide. The pituitary stalk is what I was looking for. That's how the posterior lobe is connected to the pituitary gland. Oh, it's down here. Okay, the hypothalamus produces oxytocin and ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, if you remember. So it travels down the pituitary stalk, which is just an actual structure of the brain that connects the hypothalamus to the posterior lobe of the pituitary stalk. And from the posterior lobe, it is released into the body. So the way I remembered it, because I kind of had anterior and posterior lobes confused in my mind. So to remember which lobe does not produce its own hormone, you can remember that the posterior lobe is an imposter endocrine gland. That helped me a lot because I always confused the two. So if you can remember that the posterior is the imposter and you remember the two hormones that it secretes, which are oxytocin and ADH, which is vasopressin, ABP, arginine, vasopressin. That's all the same hormone. I would recommend using that trick. Okay, now we're going to talk about the third stop on the HPA axis, which are the adrenal glands. So while the pituitary gland has multiple other target organs, the adrenal glands are the final stop in the HPA axis. So the adrenal glands receive input from the pituitary gland to secrete hormones that regulate metabolism, immunity, blood pressure, and the response to stress. So each adrenal gland is composed of 2 sections. We have 2 adrenal glands. They sit on top of each of your kidneys. If you look over here at this graphic, the top right of the graphic, you can see the adrenal glands sitting right up top. The prefix ad means on top, renal means kidney. So we have 2 of these glands sitting on either kidney. And the adrenal gland is composed of 2 different sections. The adrenal cortex, which if you look over here is everything, all of these layers except this middlemost part. That's called the cortex, because remember, anytime you see the word cortex, they are referring to the outer part of whichever structure we're talking about. And the adrenal cortex produces a lot of different types of hormones. It's the glucocorticoids, which cortisol is one of the more popular ones. Mineralocorticoids like aldosterone. Remember, aldosterone helps us intake sodium and ions so that we can take up water and increase our blood volume and blood pressure. And androgenic steroids like testosterone are also created in the cortex in smaller amounts. Most of the testosterone is produced in the cells of Leydig in the testes, but the adrenal cortex does also produce a small amount of testosterone. So the adrenal medulla is the innermost part. Just like if you think of the renal medulla, it's the innermost part If you think of the medulla oblongata in the brain, it's inside the brain. And it mostly produces the catecholamines like epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine. Those all come from inside the adrenal medulla. Okay, and then just a summary of the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis. So while your endocrine system involves many other organs, some of which we will discuss later in further detail, the HPA plays an essential role in the body's response to stress and its regulation of homeostasis. So negative feedback is super important in homeostasis. That's how a bunch of systems in our body maintain homeostasis and how they keep in check. The HPA axis is regulated by negative feedback. For example, high cortisol levels will stop the secretion of tropic hormones from both the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So if you look to the left, the graphic, we start at the hypothalamus. It releases CRH. It goes through that portal system and it interacts with the anterior pituitary. When the anterior pituitary receives that CRH, it relieves ACTH. The ACTH travels through the bloodstream and it touches the adrenal glands. It acts upon the adrenal glands and that releases cortisol. So cortisol will also act on other target cells. It'll go to your brain. It is like the stress hormone. It makes you feel stressed out. It increases, it mobilizes your glycogen storages. So it's part of your fight or flight response, the sympathetic response. But your body always needs a way to come down after one of these responses because any sort of stress that you're exposed to is not permanent. It's just a temporary stressor. So as cortisol levels rise in the blood, it feeds back to both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So it acts on both. And when it acts on both of these structures, it actually decreases the secretion of CRH and ACTH. So that in turn will decrease the levels of cortisol. And that's basically how negative feedback works. And we see negative feedback in almost all of the bodily systems that we study that we're going to see on the MCAT. So it's a very important thing to know conceptually. 50% said C, 50% said D. And the correct answer is C. So let's take a look. When experiencing an increased blood concentration level of cortisol, all of the following would happen except. So that except, we're looking for what wouldn't happen when cortisol levels increase. So an eventual decrease in ACTH secretion, that would happen when cortisol levels increase in the blood, because remember, the negative feedback loop that cortisol is involved with, it feeds back and it actually inhibits the pituitary gland from secreting ACTH the higher the cortisol levels get. So if we see an increase in blood concentration of cortisol, you will see an eventual decrease in ACTH. And you're also going to see a decrease in CRH for the same exact logic. So it acts on the pituitary to decrease ACTH secretion. It also acts on the hypothalamus to decrease CRH secretion. You would also see an increase in gluconeogenesis because that's just another function of cortisol. It mobilizes our glucose storage and it provides energy. So the only thing that wouldn't happen would be C. So immediate feelings of calm and relaxation are not something that coincides with the release of cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone. So you would probably be feeling more stressed out or more anxious. And it would probably coincide with like an activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So you would not feel calm or relaxed with it. So that's why C is the correct answer.